A big issue in tech is the lack of funding that goes to underrepresented minorities and women. Today, we are going to chat about that with TechCrunch's Ryan Lawler, Monique Woodard of 500 Startups, Laura Gomez of Atipica, and Y Combinator's Michael Seibel.
Beautiful. So I want to thank everybody for being here in the audience. To start, for this panel, it's all about funding underrepresented founders and entrepreneurs. I was hoping that we'd like to give founders in the audience or future founders in the audience some insight into the fundraising process and hopefully get some practical advice for how we can improve that. To start, I'm just going to go down the line and let everybody introduce themselves because they'll do a better job of it than I would. So start with me.
Hi, I'm Monique Woodard. I'm a venture partner at 500 Startups, where I kind of manage our global fund, Africa investments, as well as manage the 500 Shades micro fund, and work with the accelerator, of course. We're a venture fund and accelerator with about 350 million assets under management.
Okay.
I'm Michael Seibel. I'm the CEO of YC, managed the Other Stage program, and before that I did 2 startups. One was called Justin TV and Twitch, and the other was called SocialCam.
Hi, I'm Laura Gomez, and I'm the CEO and founder of Atipica. We're venture-backed by True, Caper, and Precursor. And Atipica is actually a data-driven, patent-pending startup around demographics of the resume to understand diversity around the talent lifecycle.
Okay, so Laura, let's start with you because you're a founder, you're a woman, you're a person of color, and you've been through this fundraising process. So maybe you can give some insight into what that was like for you, and what were some of the biggest challenges or takeaways that you had from that process?
So I thought I would be at an advantage because I had worked at very well-known tech companies like YouTube, and I was an early Twitter employee. So I thought that all of my sort of accolades and experience would open the doors to venture capital. It didn't quite happen that way, especially given that I'm a solo female founder of color. So I had a female founder. She has a co-founder, and she emailed me. She called me the trifecta of difficulty because founding solo female founders, especially of color, is really hard. What I learned that I was able to get the first meetings because of my network, but I wasn't able to actually get the funding, especially during the first ideation of the company. So I learned a lot through that. I think at the end, even when I got my term sheet for my lead investor, it was very surreal because I didn't think that that would have happened. I still don't. But I think one of the things that I learned was I can get the first meetings, but can I get them to fund me when I don't look like the typical founder that they fund?
And so what was the feedback that they were actually giving you?
They wanted a CTO. They wanted more proof of concept. They wanted traction. I had all of I didn't have the CTO, but I had everything else. I'm a first-time founder. They wanted to know where my leadership skills were at. So I got a lot of positive feedback, and I kept all those emails because I felt like each one of those emails would have given me the chance. And so when I did meet my lead investor and my board member, I had all the questions. I even had a 5-page PDF on the main question that they had for me, and I forwarded it to them so he could forward it to the partner. So I was very well prepared by the time I had met him.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Monique because part of what you do as part of 500 Startups, and I should disclose, I spent some time at 500 Startups, and we briefly overlapped before we go into this question. So you've spent some time there, and a lot of what it's focused on is sort of education of entrepreneurs and helping them prepare for that fundraising process. So especially for underrepresented founders, people of color, people people from outside the Silicon Valley ecosystem, what are some ways that you advise them to improve their pitches or to go into the fundraising process?
You know, I think a lot of things are the same, but when you look at some of the differences that you see and when underrepresented founders are pitching to investors, what I notice is that a lot of underrepresented founders come from outside of Silicon Valley. And so what you'll notice is that they're not speaking the language of Silicon Valley. They're not speaking the language of a lot of these investors. And so a lot of it is just helping them bridge that communication gap. So it's not about their metrics not being the same. It's not about their product not being as good. It's really about being able to communicate in a way that these investors will understand and relate to. And so a lot of it is about trying to get them to just understand the language that an investor is speaking. You know, I really kind of get frustrated with investors when they talk in what I call investor speak. And there's a very simple way to lay out a question, and then there's a very convoluted way to lay out a question. And sometimes investors tend to do that. I will completely own up to the fact that I tend to do that also. And so it's not about, you know, trying to dumb down a question. It's about talking like a normal person.
Right. Michael, I want to bring it around to you because you've been on both sides of the table, first as an entrepreneur and later, you know, as a partner and CEO of Y Combinator, part of the decision-making process in accepting folks into your batch. So do you have any stories from, you know, being a first-time entrepreneur right out of college with Justin TV, sort of what that was like and what you learned along the way?
I think I was very lucky. Justin TV was a horrible idea. My first start, the idea was my co-founder Justin wearing a camera on his head and broadcasting his life 24/7. It's a horrible idea. I think where I was extremely lucky was our team. We had 4 co-founders, including myself. We had an extremely technical team. And I think that that was a huge advantage for us because investors basically could believe that we would build whatever we needed to survive. And we did. Like, it took 8 years, but Justin TV became a platform for other people broadcasting, then became Twitch, and then became a billion-dollar company. And so I think that, you know, oftentimes what I tell YC founders is, you know, if you're a minority, it's going to hurt you here. But that's basically the way it is in most places. What you have to do is you have to be 20% better at everything else. And that means your team has to be 20% better, your growth has to be 20% better, you need to be 20% better at managing your money. Everything else has to be 20% better. And I would argue that, like, in many ways, what we see at Y Combinator is that the companies that get the initial funding really, and the ones who are hot on demo day, aren't always the companies that end up succeeding. So it turns out that having that extra frugality, that extra push, can be something that's really, really, really helpful when things aren't going well, when you have to double down. And we see a lot of people who can't take not being the hot company. They just break down. And so I think that, you know, in many ways, it's harder, but in many ways, doing startups is really hard. Right. And so
I'm curious how your experience comes back into the selection process, since you are seeing all these companies before they even come into YC, and given your experience, how you think about teams and how you think about what they look like before they join.
So I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about how to get into an accelerator, and it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that I do is that even though, you know, thousands and thousands of people apply to Y Combinator, most don't get personalized answers as to why they don't get in. But if people email me, they can actually, you know, I will actually go and look. And you would be surprised because I think people don't get in for the same reasons, regardless of their background. Everyone from, you know, a minority from outside of America to a Stanford MBA, it's the same set of reasons. And it usually comes down to team. They don't have a co-founding team that can execute the minimum viable product, or it comes down to commitment, They haven't quit their jobs, or they're not doing the most they could possibly do. Maybe they have to work, but they're not doing the most they could be doing. Or it comes to speed. They've been working for some period of time and they haven't launched, or they haven't progressed. And like those things are across every socioeconomic, across every demographic, across every set of advantage. And so really, like, those are the things we look at. Like, we don't care what school you went to, what your background is. And we find those people in crazy different places. You know, last batch, for example, was over 40% of the companies came from outside the United States.
Right. So with that in mind, a lot of people, or some people, let's say, would argue that, you know, there's just sort of a pipeline problem. Like, there are fewer founders who are people of color that make it to Series A. Okay, Laura's shaking her head. That just don't get there. So I'm curious how each of you might respond to that.
I'm going to respectfully contradict Michael here on the fact that, like, they're not moving fast enough, or they haven't quit their jobs. A lot of founders of color can't bootstrap, and they don't have a family and friends around. So therefore, they can't really quit their jobs.
Well, I mean, just to push back on that, we fund tons of companies at Bootcamp. If you listen to what I said specifically, it was just that, are you doing the most you can do? So we have founders who've got kids who can't get their jobs, and then the question is, are they grinding as hard as they can on their startup on their spare time? But what we actually see more of are the MBAs who want to preserve the option to go get a good job, to go work at Google or Facebook. And so they're working on their startup on the weekend when they have the money, they have the time, and they don't come from underrepresented backgrounds.
So those are different criteria then?
No, it's not different criteria. I'm just saying, if you can be all in, you should be. If you can't, you should be working as hard as you can be.
So my experience was that I had some sort of mild success being an early Twitter employee. So that wealth creation from an IPO gave me the ability to bootstrap, which meant bootstrapping to an offshore team in Mexico and still maintaining a lifestyle in the Bay Area. But I think if I hadn't had that money from Twitter, I probably wouldn't be up here. So I think that it's really important to understand where a lot of founders of colors fall through the crack, because they don't have that friends and family and or the ability to go all in.
I mean, Laura makes a really good point, because if you look at the diversity numbers for large tech companies, you'll see people of color very underrepresented in some of those companies. And so then when there's the opportunity to get a windfall, a lot of people of color just are not in that opportunity set. And so, you know, those gaps in large tech companies and startups really impact the ability of people of color to then participate in the startup economy in a really significant way.
Okay. I think with this conversation, what we're talking about specifically, and I want to underline this, is people that are already within the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And that raises the question of how important is it for investors to get on a plane and find founders where they are, rather than expecting them to come here? Extremely.
For us, 500 Startups, the accelerator, is generally made up of a third companies that come from inside Silicon Valley, a third who come from somewhere else in the US, and then a third who are international. And I get on a plane on a regular basis to try to find founders who are not making it to Silicon Valley. You know, I believe for me and the founders that I'm looking for, most of them are going to come from outside of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. So I go to places like New York, Atlanta, Miami, SoCal, Chicago, Detroit, to try to find Africa, to try to find those types of founders. And, you know, I think a lot of investors and VCs are less willing to kind of do that, and are more comfortable looking in their own backyard and looking at these founders. But if you really want to say, look, I'm looking for a broad scope of entrepreneurs to invest in, I am looking for diverse entrepreneurs, and you sit in your office in Silicon Valley, that just does not work.
You know, I'll be the controversial one here. The one thing that happened to me when I first came to the Valley is a lot of people lied to me. And by lying to me, what they really were doing was they didn't want to hurt my feelings. So they wouldn't tell me, why are you creating a startup, guy with the camera on his head, why aren't you doing something in software? They wouldn't give me the core advice they would give other founders because they thought, oh, like that might hurt my feelings. I don't want a bad reputation, especially with a minority. And so I'm just going to keep it real. YC, we travel everywhere. We find founders everywhere. If you're going to wait for investors to find you, this is not your business. Like, investors are going to sit on Sand Hill Road. Mm-hmm. And like, no matter what they should do, that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Most good angels aren't going to go out there and travel. Sorry. So, one of the number one things I tell people is if you can, once again, if you can, get yourself here. Because I want to change how people think about doing a startup. It's like getting into the NBA. The only people who make it sacrifice almost everything and do it with crazy low odds. Mm-hmm. And those are the real odds. That's the real game we're playing here. And so, if you told Michael Jordan when he was a high schooler he had to be somewhere to make it, he'd go. And not everyone can, right? I totally agree with you. But the challenge is that also not everyone can make it in the NBA, right? And I feel like if we lie to people about the odds, if we say to people, oh, you can do X, Y, and Z, you can break every rule, we're not giving them the information they need. We're not giving them the advantage. So yeah, well, YC will go everywhere, and we do. If you're expecting, unnamed Sand Hill Valley, Sand Hill Road VC to come find you, mm-hmm. You're going to be waiting a long time. Even if you live in San Francisco, you're going to be waiting a long time.
So I'm wondering, how important that is for an accelerator to be a credentialing agent for entrepreneurs.
That's YC. I mean, YC, I would argue, takes people who are outsiders and makes them insiders. And that's the number one thing we do. It's the number one thing we do. And sometimes, like you said, just getting in the door is half of your shot.
Yeah.
Right.
I did do an accelerator as well. So I do have to say that I think I did Alchemist, which is enterprise accelerator. And even my demo day was incredible that we did. So I do think that there is a benefit for founders of colors to think about accelerators as the first stepping stone into getting in front of a large audience of venture capitalists.
And a lot of founders don't, especially underrepresented founders and founders from outside of the Valley, don't come with a network, a Silicon Valley network. And so for accelerators like 500, like YC, taking in those founders and then giving them access to the existing network that we have is the way to speedily on-ramp them to having a Silicon Valley network. Now, what they do with that network is completely up to them and completely up to their level of hustle. But we definitely provide, the platform and the connections that you can use to make it.
Okay, so with the last few minutes, going back to practical advice. So two things. Number one, how to get that first meeting. Number two, how to go from that first meeting to a second meeting. And what are the most important things?
How to get a first meeting. Be persistent in how you, well, first of all, I would say, present yourself well in that first interaction. I get so many emails that don't have any sort of information about what your startup is, why I should be engaging with you, anything that will hook me and make me want to answer that email and say, look, let's have a conversation, let's engage with each other. So present yourself well in that first interaction. Try outside of email, try engaging on Twitter, try engaging, lots of VCs have blogs, try engaging on their blog. Really do stuff that's slightly, that a lot of other people might not be doing. Everyone's emailing, everyone's asking for, LinkedIn connections. Try to follow me on Twitter and talk to me there. And then second, I would say, how do you get that second meeting? By having something really interesting. By having a product that I think is different, is game-changing. By understanding your metrics and making me try to understand it. I think it's just generally be interesting.
Right.
And know what that investor is interested in. Right. You know, talking to someone who is mostly consumer about something that's enterprise might not be the best fit.
Right.
Talking to someone about drones who's really interested in SaaS products, that's not the right fit. So understand what the investor is actually interested in.
Right.
To be really brief, I would say your goal is not to get a fundraising meeting. That's not like the first goal of any founder. That's not the first goal of any company. Your first goal is to build a team that can build the product. Your second goal is, if you can, get some users. This is a leverage game, and you've got to bring something to the game in order to force investors to want to respond to you. And so don't bring a story, don't bring an email, don't bring an idea, bring a team, bring some users. Even 10, that's how you get an unfair advantage in this game.
Right. And Laura, get into that second meeting.
Yes, very briefly, Charles Hudson from Precursor and Mitch and Frida from Caper, I actually had known them about 14 months before they invested. It's a lot of patience. My largest angel, I had known him 9 months. And the lead investor actually started off as not a pitch meeting. I wanted to do a partnership with one of their portfolio companies. But I do think getting that first meeting, ask other founders. I'd be more than happy to open up. Ask other founders. I've gotten so many non-people of color asking me for intros to VCs, but the founders of color, it's really hard for them to ask. So keep asking. And then the second meeting is saying, being very direct. How do you see my company? Is this something of interest? Be very direct so you don't waste your time on that second meeting or persisting on a second meeting that's not going to get anywhere. And going back to Monique, talk to the right partner. I talked to a lot of partners that weren't interested in what I was building, even thought the firm itself would have been.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks again for the panel. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you.
All right.